And with that cue, it's 10:30. We're going to get this show on the road. We're not going to be like a railroad. We're going to be like the river industry and be on time, right? We're going to be like a port and make sure that things happen and get moved through and on and get the economy going. Good morning. My name is Ken Erickson. It's a pleasure to see you this morning. And on the screen, hopefully we'll see some other team members that will be joining us on this panel here, looking at the Kentucky Riverports and what's going on in a very special project with the Kentucky Transportation Cabinet. Today, second day of the IMX event. Very exciting. We heard a lot of great information yesterday. Now I'm kind of biased. I thought that first session yesterday was pretty special. But certainly throughout the day, the number of people that we were able to meet, the number of folks that we were able to engage with, have conversations without masks for most of us, and be able to shake hands has been very touching and very exciting. And it's bringing back that relationships that we have here. And there's certainly a buzz as you walk around and be able to engage with one another and to hear people's stories, hear about people's families. And that just shows the relationship that we have with one another as we do care for each other as we come out of this environment that we've been in. But meanwhile, the Kentucky Transportation Cabinet has embarked upon a look at their riverports and trying to get understanding, what does this system look like? What is it that it is? What is required to go forward? And what are some of the things that will be needed as they go forward as a transportation cabinet? And so today, we'll be having this panel looking at this. And on the bottom here in the room, Jeremy Edgeworth is the project oversight for the Kentucky Transportation Cabinet. He's going to be addressing it from that perspective of their goals and why they launched into this important study. In the upper right corner here in the room is Chandler Duncan. He's the project director on the project team, and he's going to be giving the background from a project standpoint of how we're addressing this, some of the work that we've done. And then in the top left corner is my colleague, Paul Bingham, with IHS Markit, and he's actually in California. Chandler, I'm not certain where you are. You're not at a hotel parking lot this time. And Jeremy is in Kentucky. And I have to address that we have one Riverport director here from the Port of Paducah. And it's good to have Tim Cahill with us here. And if I say something wrong, Jeremy, your man's here to take care of me. So we got bases covered here this morning. So with that, we're going to get ourselves going here. And I'll get the slides back up here as we go forward. So it was a multimodal approach that they're taking, and again, here's the agenda. We'll be looking at the overview, the specific tasks and approach that were taken and that are being used, the outreach efforts that we had, and the traffic forecasts that we're looking at, and a lot of detail around that. Those who sat in here yesterday and saw the panel on agriculture with the St. Louis Freightway and looking at USDA study that you saw, the underlining data in that was coordinated through Paul Bingham with Transearch, so he's got a very intimate knowledge around that data and what that looks like, so we'll give some context around that. And then we'll have a question and discussion period at the end. So we look forward to hearing your questions and your thoughts. And with that, I'm going to turn this over to Jeremy. And Jeremy, we're on your first slide here.
Okay. Thanks, Ken. To give you a little background on the study, the last time the Transportation Cabinet had taken a good look at our riverports was in 2008. This document provided an in-depth inventory of the existing public riverport authorities, their infrastructure, provided a SWOT analysis of each public riverport, and made some general policy recommendations, but it was admittedly dated. Ken, if you want to go to the next slide. Jump ahead to January 2018. At the Kentuckians for Better Transportation Conference, the governor in his keynote address touted the advantages Kentucky has with our waterway network. He challenged those in attendance to find ways to better utilize our waterways to spur economic growth and development. The Public Riverports and the Kentucky Association of Riverports, led by Greg Pritchett from Henderson County Riverport Authority and Brian Wright from the Owensboro Riverport Authority, took up the challenge. They drafted the framework for a new study to address the governor's challenge and approach the leadership of the Transportation Cabinet and the Cabinet for Economic Development. Both cabinets agreed the study was needed and the necessary funding was identified, thus kicking off the Kentucky Riverports Highway and Rail Freight Analysis Study. Ken, if you want to go to the next slide. So the study will provide an in-depth analysis of the freight moving out of, into, and through Kentucky. This is looking at freight on all modes, road, rail, and river, and then really diving into the commodities that are currently moving through Kentucky and understanding the existing role of freight in Kentucky's economy. What are the opportunities for growth and expansion? What are the growth opportunities for each public river port, our 7 active ports and our 4 developing ports? And then what are the commodities they need to be pursuing? What infrastructure is needed at each port to pursue these new commodities? Ken, if you want to go to the next slide. So these are the goals of the study. I'm not going to read all of these, but let me highlight a few. The study will provide guidance for public river ports. Some of the ports are large enough to have well-developed master plans, but some are one-man part-time operations. The study will give each port strategic guidance on how to grow their port. It will also provide ready information they can share with other agencies and interested parties about their port facilities and the role of their ports. Next is to improve utilization of waterways and inspire more inland waterway use. This goes back to the governor's challenge in 2018. This would help to relieve the congestion on our roadway network and tap into the potential Kentucky has with its geographic location on the inland waterway system. It will also enhance Kentucky's economic opportunities and leverage our river ports for economic development. One thing we learned early on in this process is that our economic development cabinet and even the local economic development staff frequently don't understand what a port is. They do not understand how they operate or the benefits of the local, regional, or state economy. So this study will help assess and develop growth recommendations for each public river port, outline growth sector opportunities, and opportunities to enhance international trade. The study will also provide promotional materials for Riverports through a marketing toolkit that's being developed to demonstrate the economic benefits of a port, as well as how to market a port. This can be a tool for economic development leaders, Riverport managers, local governments, and others to use to promote our waterway network for both foreign and domestic commerce. There are other goals and objectives related to commodities and modeling freight movements that I will leave to my fellow panelists to cover. The last goal is identifying funding options and recommendations at the state level for all Riverport improvements. Kentucky's current state investment in our public riverports is very limited compared to many of our neighboring states. So we want to ensure that the investments that are made are on point and as strategic as possible. Ken, if you want to go to the next slide. So with that, I'll turn it over to Chandler Duncan as a consulting team project manager to discuss the specific project tasks and processes.
Thanks, Jeremy. I'm glad to be here today. And Ken, for others, I am dialing in from Charlotte today, so North Carolina. And I'm very excited to be sharing about this project. And I'll be talking about how we're approaching the project and what we're doing to get at many of these goals and objectives that Jeremy had just shared about. So let's go ahead to the next slide. Our project team, we have a number of different organizations that are collaborating in this effort. Most notably, Metro Analytics is the prime consultant, where I'm here as a managing partner. Our freight practice is working very closely with IHS Markit, which is where Ken and Paul are from. And they're providing a lot of really great data and business analysis insight that is going into how we understand Kentucky's freight market, particularly with respect to the waterways, and also how it is changing in a couple of different scenarios for how it's going to look in the future. Also, we have a local firm called QK4 that understands Kentucky's transportation system probably as well as anyone that I know, and they bring a great local perspective as far as the transportation system in Kentucky, its history, how it develops, what the stakeholders are doing. And then also Razor Communication is also a partner there in Kentucky, which is helping with communications and the marketing toolkit, putting a lot of the materials together. So if we go to the next slide, the project overview as to what we're doing in the project. Really, we're looking to evolve an understanding of Kentucky's riverport economy throughout the project. And it really began with understanding the markets that are in play when we talk about freight that is moving with Kentucky's waterways and how that might change as the economy changes all the way out to 2050. By understanding those markets, that has enabled us to move forward into understanding the economic development process and how those markets interplay with land markets, other transportation sectors, other modes, and really what role do the river ports play in all of the change that is happening? What are the opportunities with that change, or also what are some of the things to be concerned about with that change? And with that understood, then we can really look at how our investments in the riverport infrastructure and other supporting infrastructure, how that can pay off for the entire Commonwealth of Kentucky, how that can pay off for particular stakeholders, ports, but also business and industries that are in Kentucky or that might want to be in Kentucky, as well as trading partners elsewhere potentially. And then finally telling the story that gets into that marketing toolkit as far as being able to make the case for funding and also make the case for how and why the Kentucky Riverports are potentially competitive assets for businesses that may want to be in Kentucky or investors that may want to put money into the Riverports or their clients. So this is kind of the overall game plan by which this understanding is being developed. We are currently right in the middle of this. We basically are wrapping up the understanding of the economic development process, and we're starting to really look at investments with the ports. And over the course of the summer, we're going to be modeling and looking at investment packages, and then that will get us into our marketing toolkit as we get to the end of the summer. Next slide. The next slide actually kind of talks about the specific tasks that we're undertaking. Our initial task was understanding the existing role of the Kentucky Riverports in the freight economy. And then that led us into forecasting the future trade volumes and performance implications. That first task led us to a summit that we had, one of 3 summits that was held back in the fall, where we really got to share with stakeholders what we knew about these freight markets, and also got to hear from them about how they're experiencing those markets and what it means to their business. We had another summit in the spring, or I guess it might have been late winter. It was in March. We had another summit where we looked at those forecasts and we looked at what could change. We didn't look at just one forecast. We looked at multiple forecasts and what could be driving these markets in the future, and what are the implications of that change for the Riverport business and for the shipper and carrier businesses. And then through that, that led us into a process of visiting all of the Riverports in Kentucky. We had visited them the first time back in that first task, but the second time we're going back visiting them, talking about changing and talking about the future and talking about, is what you think you need today, what you're going to need in the future. And that has led us to the point where, again, as mentioned before, we're able now here in the 4th task of this to be looking at investment and performance scenarios, which will lead us to a preferred scenario and an overall roadmap for how to realize that success. The next slide. The next slide, again, when we looked at task 1, we really looked at a lot of different things as far as what are the modes of transportation that are interfacing with water, and also what are some of the commodities that are moving by water. So we have a series of profiles about what the existing market looks like. And that was a lot of the content that we had, as well as a lot of input from the ports about what they're experiencing. The next slide. The first summit just had this is just an outline of that summit that we had back in the fall. We looked at the state of the ports, the different freight movements that are in that market, the economic development process, and how that currently is utilizing the Riverports, and maybe how they would like to be doing that. The current funding situation, how the ports interact with the other modes, and then we closed it up with a wrap up of what would take us forward. Next slide. Now in our task 2 that we just recently wrapped up, that was again where we looked at the forecast. Here we have a couple of maps. I'm going to allow Paul Bingham to share more about those forecasts, so I'm not going to steal too much of that thunder, other than to say that the reason that we looked at the forecast was, again, so that we could understand what those implications are for the performance of the existing system and how they can inform future needs, as well as future opportunities, possibly to increase, say, modal capture and other things on the Riverports. So the next slide, we had our second summit. This is the one that I had mentioned earlier. And there are specific sessions. We got into looking at changes in federal policy because we have a new administration since our first summit. We also looked at what some of the other states were doing. We got a really nice cross section of how other peer states are investing in their Riverports. We had an opportunity to show the forecast, which Paul will be getting into. We also had the opportunity to look at how the other modes moving forward might work with waterways, and how the waterway share of different commodities may change as significant changes happen in Kentucky's economy. And then we spent the last part of that summit really segueing in, talking about specific types of infrastructure needs, how they can get paid for, what's likely to be paid for, what may yet need to be paid for, where we may need to look for some funding sources. And then also we had a really good discussion about economic development and innovation hubs and the different things that Kentucky's economic cabinet is trying to do for economic development, and how the investment in the ports can have a symbiotic relationship with the whole economic development process. And then next slide. And that kind of takes us to the present moment where we are now. And so what's happening as we speak, the team on this project is actually taking specific investments in different types of Riverport infrastructure and other services, and really looking at how that shapes up into a couple of different strategies that we can compare, and we can look at the economic impact, the performance impact, the investment requirements for those scenarios. And that is, again, leading us towards a final summit that we'll be having near the end of the summer, that will ultimately roll up into a preferred investment package, but also a marketing toolkit that takes all the business intelligence that we've gotten from this project and operationalize it so that individual ports can use it, economic developers can use it, and people really have it's like putting an overhead light instead of looking at it with a flashlight as far as the market and the economic outlook for Kentucky's Riverports. And so with that, I will hand it over to Paul Bingham, who can share more specifics about the forecasts and what we're seeing in the economy for the Kentucky waterways. Paul?
Actually, Ken, you're going to talk about the outreach, and then I'm going to talk about the forecast.
That's correct. Thank you, Chandler. Appreciate that. And yeah, as we looked at these outreach efforts, as Chandler is outlining through the tasks, and meeting with the individual Riverport directors and other participants in the river industry, we did that back in September, October. If you remember IMX last year, I was broadcasting from some river locations along there, so Kentucky offered a backdrop for last year's IMX and some of the sessions that we were having, and that was a lot of fun. Got a lot of good feedback, and the river industry has a lot to offer and a lot to show. And certainly as we went out and had these interview sessions, meeting with the port directors, getting understanding, kind of one, to meet them, two, to be able to hear some of the things that we needed to capture, some descriptive information to profile the ports, the river ports, to gather that some sort of demographic information, if you will. But then importantly, to hear what it is, as kind of like a look in the mirror and trying to know what you're looking at. What is it that you have now, and where is it that you see yourself going? What are those hindrances that you have and are experiencing, and what are those obstacles that you've got to overcome as you go forward here? So as we went last September into October, covered the state back and forth as we went over there. Now, there are 11 river ports in the state of Kentucky. 7 of them are currently operating, and then there's 4 that are developing. And of those 4, a couple of them were more active previously, but with certain changes in commodity flows and certain economic realities, certainly have changed their footprint. And as we had gone through and met with the different individuals, we started getting a good picture, as I'm on my next slide here, and looking at, okay, we took the volume of commodities that were flowing through, into, out of their reach, if you will, of each of these ports. And we have this defined reach of 90 minutes from the Riverport, and how far can you go? And it's not just that it was going over into the next county, but it's really was going over the river bridges where there were some, and now you're into multiple jurisdictions, multiple states, and then multiple counties. Now, conceivably then, many of these drive areas or these hinterland areas overlap with one another, so you can't really add all these numbers up to get to a bottom line total, because that would be some double counting in these numbers and maybe even triple counting or quadruple counting in some of these instances. But what we have here is a look at what are some of the dominant modes in those for those around those Riverport areas, the tonnage that's moving through there, around there, in there, originating there or destined there, and then what is the value of those freight or that commodity. So it's a very freight-focused study, looking at here's what is, and then as we start to unpack this and start looking at what is going to materialize, and Paul will get in that here in a moment with the forecast, but as we met with a number of the Riverport directors, we started to get not only the descriptive information, but here you can see that hinterland area, in this case for Owensboro, and it was mentioned Brian Wright was one of the organizers to really push the Transportation Cabinet to sponsor this study, as Jeremy referenced. But as you look at this, the Transportation Cabinet does make available grants through about $500,000 each year, sometimes more, sometimes less, sometimes they put it on pause, but they're matching grants. And the Riverports bring forward different funding requests, and some of the rules have changed in recent years for the types of projects that can be funded. But as we know, $500,000 and you're spreading that butter over a big piece of toast, it doesn't go far for all the projects that are really out there. And so you're kind of limited from the standpoint of a Riverport, what you could really ask of a state, but they do have the benefit as an authority to then apply for other grants, whether it's through the build programs or other opportunities that exist, whether it's at the federal government or other local agencies and different funding mechanisms that are out there. But as we went and met with the Riverports, number one, every single one of them, and we're very appreciative that the Transportation Cabinet, the governor, were actually taking a very deep dive, building on the work they did in 2008. Secondly, they also recognize they really don't know what they don't know in the sense of what is really moving in our area. What are those types of commodities that are available that maybe we could have an impact on? And as Jeremy mentioned and Chandler emphasized, it's a multimodal study. And part of it is, what does this mean for the amount of trucks that are on the road? And as we discussed yesterday, and as was discussed throughout around this room, that the fuel efficiencies you get by moving a ton of cargo on the rivers is significant. And the amount of emissions are so much lower than any other mode. And what does that look like for Kentucky? Is there some benefits around that, as well as being an economic growth engine around that, the river industry and supporting the different types of jobs, moving freight through the system there, and it's looking at all types of commodities and what that would look like as we go forward here. And then the port directors, a couple other things that they said in those first round of meetings was, being able to have then ongoing updated information, data, and looking at this, how it's sliced and diced, so for them to dig into, to have some metrics that they can start to compare against is something very important going forward here, because as was highlighted, to try to find that return on an investment for when they do make capital improvements or investments for new equipment. It's an aged system across a lot of Kentucky. Much of those Riverports have been around for a long time. They've kind of outlived their useful life, and they've also outlived the different types of commodities in certain areas. And coal, as went on yesterday morning talking about, doesn't have a bright future. And so for Kentucky, they've been a strong coal state, and you've seen economies just close up across the state of Kentucky, and the river system was a key connection point for that. Now they're trying to swing around and pivot. What is it, that next thing that we can be doing to enhance opportunities, to enhance greater use of the river system? And the other part of it was, many of them did not know how the river system was funded from the standpoint of locks and dams and dredging and other activities. So for them, there was some education that was going to come out of this for the Riverport directors, and not only for the Riverport directors, their board of directors. Each one has about 6 members as their board of directors. Most of them are appointed by either the city or county, depends on their structure. And when you start thinking about that, of the 7 operating ports, and then you add in the developing ports, you're getting yourself to 66 some members of the boards of directors that are making important decisions, but they may not see the big picture within, say, the state of Kentucky and how this all ties together from a national standpoint. So as I go on here and look at, I think, Paul, I'm coming into your section here, but that we went to the second round. I'll close up here in a second, Paul.
Yeah.
As we went to the second round of interviews, we started then digging into, all right, we're going to now give you the forecasts. Here's what we see in your area. What are those investment requirements that you have? We started putting those together in buckets and starting to assign values around those investment requirements. For the most part, the state of Kentucky would say, well, there's 500,000 we make available. They must be doing good. Well, the reality is they really don't know what's needed across the state, and so we're now inventorying all those investment requirements and to put together a sheet that shows here's the type of investments required across the state of Kentucky as we go forward here. And then we had discussions around those commodity flows and then start enhancing what that could look like for the future as they go forward. And Paul, we'll turn it over to you of looking at the Riverports, the highways, and then how you put together the forecast. So Paul?
Well, thank you. So, Ken, to do the market analysis in terms of what's useful for the ports, obviously, we needed to look forward. As Ken said, coal as the leading market is fading away. It's in the past. Even though there's still substantial coal movements today, we have to look realistically from an economic development perspective for the state of what's going to be there in demand to handle in the future. So our objectives included looking forwards at the total freight market for the ports that Ken talked about, both the developing and the operating ports, and look to the long term, have long-term forecasts for the regional modal freight flow demand for the region. And as Chandler had mentioned, we did this with multiple forecast scenarios. We had a baseline scenario, and then we had what's essentially a higher growth and a lower economic growth scenario. And these were before any diversion to a Riverport inland waterway movement. So this is looking at the modes and the momentum behind what is being used to handle that freight today, and then looking forwards to what is the potential for the future. Ken, let's go to the next slide. So as we said earlier, we looked at this port hinterland for each of the individual ports, which in the aggregate is what's mapped here on this slide. This is obviously reaching into the neighboring states. As Ken mentioned, this covers parts of Illinois, Indiana, Missouri, Ohio, Tennessee, and West Virginia, in addition to a majority of the state of Kentucky in terms of the potential market hinterlands. But also, as Ken mentioned, very importantly, we are not trying to pick winners and losers in this, and we're looking at markets holistically such that the Riverport markets, they can and they do overlap. So this allows for potential competition. Obviously, as you get down to individual commodity handling, individual companies, that may make a difference in terms of what makes a particular location competitive on the system. Ken, let's go to the next slide. To do the market analysis, we use the IHS Markit Transearch product. This is a commercial freight flow database that covers long-term movements on an annual frequency in tons and value at a commodity level. For the study, we use the calendar year 2018 as the baseline. So this is pre-pandemic, obviously, in terms of what the historic look was. And then the forecast horizon out to 2045. So long-term forecast, but tied to a geography that was both domestic freight and international trade. For the United States, that included, as the map had showed, the Kentucky counties for each of the river ports within that 90-minute approximate drive time defined, and then into the neighboring states likewise. So the river-adjacent Riverport market counties for each of those neighboring states. And then for the remainder of the state of Kentucky and then onwards, outwards across the country, business economic areas, which are from the U.S. Department of Commerce, aggregations of counties around metro areas and other portions of the states. On the international trade side, we have trade specifically with Canada and with Mexico on both the import and export flows modally. And then we capture the rest of the entirety of U.S. world trade, the imports and exports overseas flagged at the commodity level across all the other dimensions of the forecast database. So one last slide to look at some results here. Ken, let's go to our last slide for the freight forecast. The graph shows the base year 2018 tonnage levels for each mode. We have rail on the left, and then truck and water, and then the total aggregating across those. The three bars for the forecast show the baseline first in the light blue, and then the green is an optimistic or higher growth scenario, and then that purple on the right for each of those modes is a slower growth forecast. Under all three of the scenarios, we see substantial growth. The column on the left provides the aggregate growth over that entire long-term period out to 2045 for each of the three scenarios for the total tonnage, and then the truck and rail modes, which provide the greatest opportunity for diversion to these Kentucky river ports. Then you can see the range of growth, even under the pessimistic scenario. In total, we expect under the fundamentals that are there for demand of still over 10% growth over the long term, and under a higher growth, which we would believe to be possible under a number of assumptions, growth of 24%, almost 25% growth in tonnage by 2045 in the aggregate. Now, what comprises that? Obviously, there's some tremendous differences by commodity and by mode. And most glaringly, you can see the greatest growth is coming from the commodities that move by truck. Under any of the scenarios, substantial growth in terms of total truck tonnage demand. Reflecting the composition of consumption and production in the United States and of trade of commodities that are moving in and through and nearby Kentucky by truck, and reflecting primarily the decline in coal, looking at the rail tonnage growth forecast under all three scenarios, actually a decline. Even under the highest growth scenario we have optimistically, the total tonnage decline in rail. Now, there's much more detail beneath this that is being used in the study that's port-specific, commodity-specific, geography-specific, and so forth. But this is just to present an aggregate view of when we total all of that up, what's the potential that we're looking at in terms of economic development growth that may be possible for the Kentucky Riverports to capture some of. So, Ken, I'll turn it back to you, and we'll go into Q&A.
All right, thank you, Paul. Thank you, Chandler, and thank you, Jeremy, and for the remarks. And we'll bring their faces up here and have some questions. By all means, we welcome questions from the floor. We got some time for that, and just raise your hand up. I'll have you ask it, then I'll repeat it for everyone to hear really well, and go from there. But first, while you're thinking of your questions out here, Jeremy, I'm going to come back to you. And as this project's been underway for quite a while now. And we've had a couple of summits, we've had some deliverables around this, and inevitably looking at what we've had with material and then engagement you may have had with other state cabinets. What are some feedback that you maybe hearing from those other cabinets and maybe even within the transportation cabinet itself? But has there been much discussion around this, especially around the economic development in particular?
What's interesting I've found is that a lot of states are looking at their waterways. Ohio just did a waterway plan. Illinois just finished one up. I think Missouri did one a couple of years ago. So there's a lot of interest and focus in how to better utilize our waterways because it really is an untapped resource. I think where ours is a little bit different is that we've really brought our economic development cabinet in on this study. They're partners with us on this, and we really want to help educate them because that's one thing they've really told us is that they really struggle at the statewide level, at the local level, with understanding ports. And they have such a huge turnover in their staff that once somebody gets an understanding of a port, they move on and a new person comes in. And so really that's the key behind trying to develop that marketing toolkit is leaving behind something that can help educate and inform our economic development staff so they can continue to advocate for our ports and advocate for the growth and increased use of our waterways.
Well, great. Thanks, Jeremy. And that's very important to acknowledge. And I think that's important for those in this room that the number of states that are really focusing on their waterways is important to be able to have attention given to that. And as I think you said earlier, there's some that within the government really don't know what a port is. And quite frankly, you see one port, and that's where the distinction is going to come in to try to show some of these as we go forward here. Paul, as we start looking down the road here, we didn't get into the extreme details of some of those commodities. You referenced one that's not going to perform well for a number of things, whether it's from a government intervention or action or disruption, but as well as what's going on with carbon, trying to be more green, and then the cost of electricity from alternative sources. But what are some of those commodities that you may have seen that popped up in the forecasts across the state that will show some opportunity and growth, and what do those tend to look like as kind of those newcomers or expansion on what they've been doing?
Yeah, there's two big categories, Ken, that I'd call out. I mean, there's several beyond these, but those include agriculture production, especially as we look, which you know better than me. The potential for U.S. producers to serve export markets is tremendous and is not going to go away, especially with the advantage of having an efficient transportation system to reach some of those end market customers. And inland waterways obviously provides the lowest unit cost possible to move any kind of products, whether they're in bulk form or not. Another big category, though, is some of the essentially resource-based, but they're indirectly that way in terms of some of the potential for new production and sales in the country and the shipping. And we're looking at it in some categories like plastics, which, maybe was a buzzword 50 years ago, but actually leveraging some of the low-cost production of natural gas and some of the other feedstocks. The U.S. is a global competitive producer for things like plastic resins, and the potential for growth in those, serving the end markets of those globally, for commodities that are not especially time sensitive, if the supply chains are set up, start to have attributes that potentially have some real opportunities for ports to be able to handle those. And if we look geographically where Kentucky is, on the river system, on the way out towards the gateways, not very far from some of the shale fields and some of the new gas plants being put in, there's some real potential there that we observed in terms of growing volumes that are forecast within the hinterland of some of these Kentucky ports. And there's some other manufactured categories as well. I won't go down the whole list, but things like related to auto production. There's an enormous amount of auto parts and components that move on I-75 and also move east and west. Sometimes, similarly, we think of those as, those high value added manufactured products as something, well, of course, those move by truck, but in fact, some of the those sorts of components at various stages of production, if the supply chains are set up so that they can take advantage of lower shipping costs and still meet delivery times, other modes of transport have potential to carry those. And you can even speak to another potential that we're looking at, which is potential movement of containers on the river systems, not potentially even just by the conventional container on barge, but looking forward to some proposals that exist now to actually have riverboats that carry containers that could be potentially very advantageous for some of those longer haul moves of goods that move today containerized.
Well, great. Thanks, Paul. Appreciate going into some of the details on those different opportunities that are out there. And Chandler, I want to come to you. And this is kind of unique, and maybe this should be a question for Jeremy, but it's a unique study in the sense that there's a lot of work going on, a lot of discussions and meetings, and trying to have meetings. Mainly, we did have a couple in-person meetings already with the Riverport directors and other participants. But a lot of this material is being made available. So, Chandler, what type of material is available to anyone that has interest in looking at you had 2 summits and the other material forecasts and such? What does that look like, and how engaged can people be with this study?
Well, there are a lot of ways to be engaged, and I'll definitely let Jeremy talk more about because a lot of that's going through the transportation cabinet, and Jeremy can help inform about how people are accessing that information, and he gets a lot of that traffic there. But yeah, each of the summits, has a series of presentations and things that are made available through the cabinet. They are available also, and some things are available in video form, and the reports, they're milestone reports that go in. Actually, they're going in now with increasing frequency that drill down further into the analysis and the profiles and the other things that both result from the visits to the ports, but also that elaborate on the issues in the summits. And all of those information, all of those resources are made available through the cabinet. And I can kind of let Jeremy share a little bit about how some of the people here might be able to check out, getting access to that information, because it's all on the website. Everything that's been made public is.
Yeah, everything's being hosted on the Transportation Cabinet's website. If you go to transportation.ky.gov and search for Riverports, at the bottom of that page, you'll see the link and the logo for our study that will take you to that page. We have all of as Chandler said, we have all of the presentations that were done at both of the summits. We have video recordings of each of those summits that you can go participate and review. We have, as the different documents are completed, they're being posted on the website. And once the study is completed, it will all be posted on the cabinet's website. We wanted to have a central website that was going to stay in perpetuity, something like Transportation Cabinet website. Not just a project one that's just up for the duration of the project, but we wanted to have all this information available to the public. So, you're welcome to go view all that on the Transportation Cabinet's website. It's all going to be hosted there.
Thank you, Jeremy. Thank you, Chandler. And I just want to look around the room here. Anyone with questions here on the floor? You know, as we look at this study and we think about the waterway system, and they think about navigation, the benefits that are accrued there. So now you look at some of those charts that Paul had up there, you kind of had to squint to see the waterway numbers that were on there. But that's given the fact how much volume of trucks that do move through Kentucky. And when I mean driving through Kentucky. Now you've got quite a bit that does originate or is destined into Kentucky, but there's a lot of north and south, north-south, east-west interstates that are connecting the U.S. economy. And certainly with where Kentucky is, and a lot of the Riverport directors emphasized how you capture 2/3 of the U.S. population from right there in Kentucky, and that really gives them an advantage to be that next position to add value into the system and to use a multimodal approach out there. But Paul, when you look at those numbers, you kind of squint, well, this is a Riverport study, but what would be that characterization around that volume on the waterway side as we dig in for Riverport directors then?
Well, there's obviously a lot of potential from the geographic range of the Kentucky Riverports, extending, into Appalachia, on the Ohio, and then all the way into the, in the main corridor for the Midwest, north-south on the Mississippi. The rail routes, the highway routes, including the parallel routes that are not in Kentucky, but say are running east-west, to the north of Kentucky or to the south. There's some potential for long-haul diversion that extends quite significantly. If we look at the extent of the inland waterway network, north and south, we've just heard recently about the CP and CN competing to connect with the KCS to build a north-south rail network. Well, in many ways, that's geared at looking at competition on that Mississippi extended, river waterfront waterway corridor. And, Kentucky's got, several opportunities to participate in that with the extension of the barge service connectivity by rail and truck to reach a whole number of end market economies, not necessarily as a global transshipment point like you see in Louisville with the UPS Worldport on the air cargo side, but there's some echoes of that in terms of what's potential to have for intermodal movements where you have a shorter truck dray or a movement by rail to a riverport, and then have the long haul, very efficient and also environmentally friendly inland waterway movement for that freight long haul. That's another dimension to the economic development potential here that we've surfaced in this study, is that they're clearly the environmental benefits in terms of the minimization of the carbon footprint of moving freight on water compared to any other mode of transport. And that's another, and when we look out to the long term for companies and individual consumers that take that into consideration, that's going to be another advantage that the waterway system, not just in Kentucky, everywhere is going to take advantage of, but Kentucky particularly in terms of its position geographically in that heartland, the crossroads for so much of the economic activity in the country, is evidenced by the freight volumes that we see in total predicted long term.
Well, thank you, Paul. And certainly as we think then in the big picture of the waterway system, it is connectivity, but it's also that it's a system. And whether it's imports of cargo coming into the United States through the lower Mississippi River and then being transloaded onto a barge and moving upriver, we saw with some Riverports a number of aggregates that were being imported from Asia, moving up into Kentucky Riverports, or aluminum. And with Owensboro being a delivery point on the London Merchant Metals Exchange, that's very important for them and really for the global trade of aluminum, and that they've got a benefit there. And that's certainly a key part for many banks around the world, traders, to know that they've got a secure port that's going to be operational, that's going to have equipment that can do the job. And you start thinking about that, whether that's an import move as well as fertilizer that would come in the United States, although we've seen some domestic changes around that. And then at the same time, those outbound moves of different types of cargoes that would go, it's the connectivity of the system in so many different ways, in such as domestic moves that we saw of different types of metal or wire rod that was being loaded on a barge on the Illinois waterway and then being barged down to the Mississippi right here past St. Louis, then right up, make a left turn and head east, northeast on the Ohio River, and hit some of the river ports there. Again, removing those truck moves, removing even some of those short haul rail moves that railroads do not like to use. And so you see a lot of benefits in a connected system. And so you go around this exhibit floor that's in here, and everyone in here has some sort of touch to this when you start looking at that cargo that moves through there. Well, we certainly appreciate you being a part of this education system. This is a project that's still underway. Jeremy, we appreciate the Transportation Cabinet and its support of this, the work that you're doing to lead this effort. And Chandler, we appreciate working with you. If I speak on behalf of Paul and myself, working with you and your team, delivering this project, putting together information. Again, I'll give a shout out to Tim Cahill, the Executive Riverport Director at Paducah, that's here with us today, and his participation. He's been very generous with his time with us, but all of them have, and they said they see that there's going to be value coming out of this in the long run. And it's really not just the Riverports themselves that are authorities, but then there's all the other industry and others that are operating on the system that will benefit from this. So with that, we're at the end of our time. You've been a great audience, and we look forward to hearing from you all again. Again, Jeremy, Chandler, Paul, thank you for the time. Next time, we'll have you here in person.
Thanks, everybody.
Look forward to it. Thank you. Bye now.